Hi, Victor. So I'm here with Victor from Singular. I'm Margot. I'm head of content at Addictive. And at Addictive, we help app marketers reach the right users at the right moment. We drive consistent engagement and revenue through CTV UA and app retargeting campaigns. And so I'm here with Victor from Singular. And I wanted to start this interview talking about attribution for CTV in particular, because we get a lot of questions about the accuracy and the reliability of CTV attribution. So first, Victor, let's tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about your mushroom foraging and your career so far.
Well, that was going to be my fun fact, Mario, but you kind of
Sorry,
stole my
I
thunder
spoiled
there.
it.
No worries. Yeah, just quick by way of introduction, Victor Savath, VP of Global Solutions Consulting over at Singular. For those listening and aren't familiar with Singular, we are essentially a next-gen mobile measurement provider, specializing in data movement and AI-driven insights. Great to spend some time with you today, Margot, to go into the likes of CTV attribution. Attribution in general is something near and dear to my heart. So very excited to speak with you today.
Perfect. Thank you. So let's get started. For app marketers who rely on mobile UA, who are really mostly familiar with mobile UA, how do you recommend they start thinking of CTV as a measurable and performance-driven channel rather than simply brand awareness?
Totally. Given, to your question before, like given my background, I came from the more traditional measurement space of media mix modeling. And, in that day and age, and I'm probably dating myself, there's the world of linear TV, traditional TV. And, what became obvious over, my 10 plus years in this particular space is that, CTV really changed the game in terms of just accessibility and your ability to iterate and test and have quick, timely learnings that allow you to optimize very much so like a performance channel that you might be familiar with today, right? So I think number one is that level of accessibility and iterative nature of CTV, not behaving just like a quote unquote classical upper funnel TV like channel, but that it can actually be run, measure, optimize, scale way more closer to traditional mobile performance than a lot of marketers realize that first. With that said, right, there's of course different mechanics and expectations and ways of thinking about it that I think are still very important.
Yes, and I think that's the biggest, yeah, as I said like earlier too, yeah, I think there's still a big like misconception, I guess, about CTV as just branding. So I think in that vein, then what exactly makes CTV attribution reliable, and what kind of signals do you guys rely on to make sure that marketers are really getting an accurate view of performance?
Yeah, it does come back to signal, right? And just kind of juxtapose it to that previous example of the traditional TV, where again, thinking about CTV operating in a space in which when it was introduced, there was actually a higher bar because the people that were actually exploring, testing, experimenting had a higher bar of like what we need and what they need in order to continue investment in this channel. So things that, a mobile marketer might take for granted of like, hey, you need delivery data as of yesterday, as of today. I need real-time signals. I need last hour. I need breakdowns by what creative was actually trafficked, right? Where were these placements? What campaigns? What markets was it served in? So I guess it's not even necessarily new signals, but it's kind of that expectation of when CTV essentially hit the stage to say, hey, in order for this to get any traction, these elements, these data sets actually already need to be in place. And that requirement was met, right? And is being met today. Now, when we think about attribution and the tracking, right, we're talking about, sub-second timestamps where we're saying like, we need to know exactly when these impressions were put out there. We're talking about post-back signals directly to the partner. So there's that feedback loop to say every conversion that was attributable is going to be sent back to the partner for the purposes of optimization, is going to be visible within MMP interfaces for optimization purposes. The matching and the logic that was applied so that you have the visibility of how was this decision made, right? really have enabled this ecosystem to evolve very, very quickly and build a high level of confidence, right? So in many ways, CTV kind of entering the main stage was an opportunity to build upon more or less a blank slate to say, hey, we actually have a blank slate and we have a series of requirements that performance marketers have set out. We need to build towards that. And it's not a world of kind of rebuilding from TV and going the other way. It's essentially building up based off of a set of expectations laid out by the world of performance.
Kind of applying the rules of mobile performance to a different
Exactly.
platform, essentially.
And kind of a quote unquote hidden benefit or something that CTV was a little more isolated from were things that were also impacting, the world of iOS that a little more direct, right?
Yeah.
Privacy changes that were focused specifically on the world of mobile app. CTV was also building in a world in which it was actually a different approach, a different attribution methodology. Not to say that things won't change in the future, but it's saying that, hey, in building and creation, they was also able to build, focus on a device level resolution.
Right. And this is kind of related, but you mentioned iOS, but I'm wondering if you find just in terms of the clients that you work with, the apps that you work with, do you think that marketers are actually becoming more comfortable with less information? Does that make sense? So, for example, with iOS, there was everybody kind of just lost so much access to their user level information. And so I wonder if attitudes towards, and it did recover, but to an extent, but it'll never be what it was. And I wonder if you at Singular are finding that marketers in general, as a result, are maybe more open to things like CTV that might be more experimental because now the equation of, attribution is a little bit murkier in general.
100%, right? And that's super interesting because on the point of building versus rebuilding, you're in the world of iOS in which you went from super high resolution, like Android, to a world of SK ad network where you're like, I couldn't really operate at the same cadence as I was before. And so then kind of the anchor shifted to saying, hey, there's kind of this middle ground. And as you know, with a lot of channels, the world of probabilistic, with a lot of advertisers, the world of probabilistic is like, oh, this is kind of quote unquote a new norm that I need to recognize and accept that, hey, in order to perform the best possible attribution, to make the best possible decision, I need to utilize what's actually available, right? Versus kind of going backwards to say, oh, I really wish I had this, or like, can we have perfect resolution versus can I get the best possible signals to make the best possible decision I can? And that's a great point that you mentioned of like, yeah, have the anchors actually shifted? I think what hasn't shifted is regardless of the methodology utilized is the frequency, right? And so CTV was also kind of launched in this world of like, you still need a feedback loop that occurs rapidly. We do need to look at horizons in a much more dialed in perspective as well. We can't look at 7-day horizons and look back windows, right? We also need to have that level of accountability and control around the cadences and the timeliness of signals, especially when it comes to this particular channel type or medium.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's also a matter of, I think with iOS too, marketers were kind of, it became now you just have to experiment with everything. The job kind of requires more risk to be successful than maybe it did before. I wonder about that.
Yeah, it also pushed you, sorry for jumping in, but it
No?
also pushed you to start thinking through the lens of multiple outcomes and multiple measurement methodologies operating side by side to figure out what is the most reliable number that we can report and optimize against. So it created this mentality of like, oh, it used to be just one source. And then it says, okay, that one source and one methodology. Then it said, hey, there's going to be multiple methodologies. SK Ad Network itself introduced that to say we now have two methodologies. But then it pushed the boundaries, in terms of methods to say, hey, what about MTA, incrementality testing? Like, how do we think about effectiveness of channels, not just through a single lens anymore, but a series of signals that can be read through kind of multiple lenses?
Yes, exactly. And I want to go back to what you said about finding the right kind of horizon or window
Yeah.
for CTV, which is not going to be 7 days, as you said. But I guess first I want to kind of break down for maybe people who are not super familiar with it. How does Singular connect a CTV impression to a later mobile app install, and what factors might strengthen that connection? And then we'll
Yeah,
get into
totally.
the right window
The
for
right
all of
windows,
that.
I think there's a lot to talk about configurability and windows and whatnot. But yeah, in terms of bare bones, it's making sure that number one, there's a modality of catching and capturing a touch point. And it's a recognition that this touch point isn't necessarily going to lead to an outcome on the same exact device. So you need to configure and think about collection of touch points through a more platform agnostic lens, essentially saying that this touch point can be attributed to any device regardless of where the conversion actually happens. So when you have these platform agnostic, quote unquote, singular links, you're capturing various things, IP parameters, proxies on the request header. On certain devices, you can actually capture familiar attributes like the user agent and operating system. Right? Think about CTV content on a tablet. I mean, I think everyone on Uber is like, oh, no, there's a TV. I was like, there's actually a lot of ways to deliver CTV content out there. And there's probably going to be more in the future. So then on that, you also have, as I mentioned, sub-second visibility into the timestamp. When did this occur? And that kind of sets a foundation for conversations around things like Windows. Now, when Singular sees install or re-engagement as well, right, on any of our devices, it's saying, let's make sure that when we see our installs and re-engagements, we index against all the touch points out there. You'll have some touch points coming in from mobile-only devices. You'll have those CTV touch points. And then it's executing the attribution waterfall based on the windows configured for every single touch point out there to perform CTV attribution.
Yeah, that brings me to my next question, which is what is the ideal window for CTV attribution? What are your recommendations at Singular for when is the right time?
So default in Singular, it's 24 hours, right? So we crossed
Mhm.
7 day off the list. Default within Singular is 24 hours. I think the implications there are meaningful, right? If you expose or have a attribution window that's too long, you of course have overlap. You have misattribution. You have users who naturally will organically install being credited to these channels. So if you have too short, right? Like you have it shorter than the program that they're actually watching, or might enter a scenario where the signal isn't fully represented at all and you miss the real influence. I do think a part of it is, of course, working with your partners directly to understand, hey, what makes the most sense and what do we want to start at. But generally speaking, that 1 day horizon does create a consistency with a lot of other view driven or view through based type touch points.
So I think for my personal curiosity, that what are kind of the prioritization rules? So click versus view through.
Yeah.
How do those impact CTV attribution, and what are the best practices? But also, you mentioned re-engagement, so I'd like to also get your thoughts on the future of re-engagement on CTV as well.
Which question do you want first?
Yeah. let's let's start with the re-engagement question. I'm curious what your thoughts are on how you measure that, if that's something that you guys are exploring or if it's really something that you have
No, it's
managed
something
to
that we
do.
support today. And I think that's something that I actually did want to highlight is that, when we think about conversions and outcomes, and you think about these touch points, and you say, hey, I want to make sure that these touch points are qualified to be credited with a re-engagement as well. So it's operating under very similar principles as acquisition and installs, but it's just saying, let's denote that these particular impressions could also drive a user to re-engage, right? And we need to really think about the nature of overlap between within the user experience, right? You're seeing something on that second screen, you're seeing something on the first screen, and so there is typically a higher propensity to say, "Wow, like these users are going to be exposed to multiple touch points." And you want to be in a scenario where you're crediting all the types of behaviors associated with seeing these touch points. And re-engagement, I think, is just a critical part of the equation as well, because number one, there's always the definition of like what classifies and, is the inactivity, but it's thinking of like, did we actually have an impact on a user coming back into the application and execute. You mentioned, the world of QSRs and saying, wow, like that's really interesting because I want to make sure if I see XYZ brand and it's dinner time, like I go in, I execute, that's going to be a re-engagement. It's not an acquisition. And they've made a purchase because you caught them watching their favorite show at dinner time and they subsequently executed an order. So I do think it's actually a very conducive part of the CTV equation. On the point of prioritization rules, I would actually say and argue that this is actually more important than the window in consideration of CTV, mainly because if it wasn't clear before, CTV is view through based. And within the world of traditional MMP logic, views are treated as lower intent signals as compared to clicks, right? So putting that within an example, you could be exposed 1,000 times to a particular ad on CTV with the longest attribution, but if a click occurs from another partner afterwards, the CTV touch points will be credited, right? So that's kind of the most extreme example there, but it's a realistic one to say you could have that 7-day look back. You have a lot of ads being served, but because views are put typically lower within the attribution waterfall, it will essentially never get credit relative to a click. And this is why prioritization rules are actually very important, very critical when testing, evaluating, CTV performance, right? So what these prioritization rules address, or do rather, is to say for a certain time horizon, let's make sure that we treat these views on the same level as if they were clicks. This ensures more accurate, fair attribution to CTV traffic.
Yes, I've spoken with our CTV team about this as well. What do you say to maybe if there's a marketer who would come to you and be like, well, does that mean that CTV might be taking away attribution from some of my other campaigns? Is that possible? What would you say to that, I guess?
That's something that Singular's faced as well and addresses as well. This week, we, launched MTA as well as assists. And I think when we think about taking away or giving, I think the common answer is there is overlap and they actually work together, right? And I think if you go to the question of how well do they work together and how do they contribute to the conversion funnel, that is the mentality and approach. Because we're not operating in this world where everything is single attributed, right? To one particular channel, and there's only one touch point that you could ever, get. I think from an optimization feedback loop, right, we need to separate that signal relay for optimization and signal collection for the purposes of attributing and reporting and analysis.
Right. I think that's a really good point, because also I believe we talked about this when you joined our last webinar, about how one of the biggest challenges marketers are facing is just this kind of informational silos, or people working very individually and not really taking into account the entire picture
Totally.
of the performance of their overall campaigns rather than individual ones. So it's funny that we can come back to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even here.
Totally.
So then I guess onto mistakes. So what are some common kind of setup mistakes that app marketers make starting out with CTV, and how can they avoid that?
Yeah, I think we touched on a handful of these, right? There's the windows, there's the priority rules and prioritization rules, to make sure that those are in place. But it also brings ourselves back to some of the initial questions from you, Margot, is that this mentality of how you treat and measure and optimize on CTV as well, right? And even though we've addressed it already, it's saying, let's make sure that you are optimizing and evaluating CTV like a performance channel, i.e., look at the delivery across markets. Have multiple creatives that you can actually analyze performance against and understand which ones are performing the best, providing the strongest IPMs, CPIs, ROAS at those granularities. So it's like, don't say like, oh, this channel as a whole done, right? It's what's working, what's not, right? It's not about the discrepancies and not looking at CTV as just a channel, but it's looking at what incremental audiences are we able to touch now that we're tapping into this channel? Are they higher quality households? Are they different types of users? Or is it building, conversion on my other traffic as well? So it's not looking at it within a silo, but how is it actually contributing to the overarching mix when I actually execute on CTV as well?
Yeah, how is it informing all
Yeah,
of these
it
other channels
operates
that we
very
are?
differently, right? And
Hmm.
you could say there's world of search, social, and then there's a world CTV as well, because you are essentially reaching to a household as well, right? Also very unique to the world of CTV. You're casting impressions against a household that has a series of devices as well. And, it does take that moment to think about, okay, how is it operating through my conception of the user journey? What is the thesis that I have of like how CTV is going to be contributing? And then how do I test against that hypothesis?
Yeah, and I think that leads us to KPIs, which is kind of a good segue. So, what kinds of KPIs or metrics because as you were talking about looking at the incremental value of
Yeah.
increase in value of your users or how it affects your overall user base, what should marketers be looking at? And I guess also, how should they be kind of observing that, especially if we're talking about the incremental increase?
Yeah, totally. I think there's of course the baseline that we're all familiar with. Cost per course installs, cost per re-engagement. IPMs become much, much more important to just understand the effectiveness of your impression delivery. I think ROAS and LTV become just standard table stakes, very similar to the world of mobile performance. I think with CTV specifically, this world of assists and multi-touch contributions becomes much, much, much more important to say for each of and every one of my CTV executions, every one of these creatives, how many of these installs that were attributed were done independently, solo, single attributed? That means, hey, I'm tapping into someone brand new. How many of these installs were actually helped by another, i.e., there's kind of multiple within the journey? And then last but not least is, hey, this channel, maybe it didn't drive a lot of single attributed, but it drove tons of assists in the conversion funnel, which means that it's supporting other channels within the mix to say, do I have reads across the board there, right? If you have a huge number of just co-attributed, everything here is not single attributed, i.e. it's not unique, there's huge amount of overlap, then that's the question of like, ooh, well, a lot of these are just kind of operating within this larger mix of users that I've seen before and, I'm not tapping into anything new. But if you're focused and saying there's tons of assists and there's tons of single attributed, those are very much stronger signals to establish confidence in this channel versus you mentioned, what a customer asking like, oh, isn't it just taking credit? That would be much more visible if your co-attributed outweighed both your assists as well as your single attributed.
Right, exactly. That's a very good kind of way to test whether or not this is being if anything is being cannibalized or if it's helping or if it's
Correct.
net new users. Great. And so I have my last question, which is of course, what's coming next? So looking ahead, what developments do you think will make CTV even more of a popular channel for performance rather than simply brand awareness?
Yeah, I think that was a bit of a spoiler in what I just responded with. But like when we think about singular and the way we think about assists and MTA, we think CTV is probably going to be the channel most impacted by this. So with our release, it's more visibility to the journey, not just one, two touch points before. It's saying and providing really clear KPI definition around was it single attributed? Was it co-attributed? Did this channel help others, i.e. these assists? And it gets to the heart of understanding overlap across your channels, right? And by extension, the new audiences or the audiences that you're getting ads in front of. On top of that, it's to say, wow, we can actually start crediting differently. So a multi-touch model that says we're going to give the most weight to single attributed. We're going to take some credit away if you were co-attributed. We're going to actually give you more credit if you were assisted so that you get actually a more accurate view and a more proper crediting across channels all the way from the top to the bottom of that user conversion funnel. Building on some of the things that we were discussing around re-engagement and audiences, think there's also a lot of potential for audience-based incrementality testing for CTV traffic, right? Um, Really just another set of signals to say, I have an existing audience. I want to distribute these audiences to the likes of a deep deep. I want to maintain a control group. I want to execute the ads, and I want to see, am I driving actually incremental re-engagements and re-engagement events from these experiments? And whilst that would be a much more experimental framework, I think it's, again, very critical to think about, how do I take those learnings, those experimental learnings, look at my MTA results, let me look at my MMP results, and build that triangulation model modality to make that, again, best decision that's available.
Mhm. We're obviously quite biased at Addictive, and that last part is very interesting to us.
Yeah. It crossed my mind actually in think about this. I was like, yeah, these things, right? And this is all stuff that we're pushing. It's like the world of CTV and the world of re-engagement, and saying like, wow, are these frameworks actually aligning and conducive for each other?
Right. And I really like the idea of being able to see kind of holistically where these things overlap, because at least in the conversations that I've had, the big fear, as I said before, is cannibalization and taking credit for something that wasn't. But if we can see clearly, not only exactly what this was with high probability attributed to, and see also how it impacts other things, I think that's very key for marketers who are still on the fence. But thank you so much, Victor. This was a great conversation.
Yeah.
Even longer than I expected, of course, but that's good. It was a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining. But I hope everyone enjoyed it, and I'll see you in our next interview.